to be a very special and particularly interesting CCI seminar, which is focusing on some of the really big global events in a whole string moving up from now till 2030. So I think we're all agreed that we're at a very strange time in global politics, with administration rapidly undoing environmental regulation across the world. We're kind of falling apart over questions about nature. A lot of big implications around geopolitics, around what's happening to funding, to work for nature, for people, for climate. And yet we're also at a moment where we've got a sequence of major events coming up, which take us from 2025 now through to what was set as the deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals for Agenda 2030, when the world is supposed to have achieved some very major targets for nature, for people, for climate. But some of the processes and the global events leading up to 2030 are, of course, the conferences of the parties around the three big conventions that were kicked off in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, and this is why they're called known as the Rio Trio. The Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biodiversity, and the one that's often a little bit forgotten, the Desertification Convention, which some people call the Land Convention. And what we wanted to do in this seminar was take a look at that whole trio, which have some commonalities, which have some differences, to think about some of the synergies between them, to think about that at this particular moment when we're sort of still fairly shortly in the aftermath of the autumn conventions, so COP16 in Cali in Colombia for the CBD, the climate convention COP, and the Riyadh desertification COP, and many CCI partners were there, and we'll have reflections on what happened or failed to happen at that time. And then looking ahead, there's a lot of anticipation that the next climate COP, COP30 in Belém in Brazil, will be quite a key moment for nature too, because of the way Brazil is seeking to lead this around questions of nature-climate synergies and nature-based solutions and so on. So anyway, we've got a fantastic panel, and I will turn to them in a moment. Interestingly, their names all begin with M, which is the qualification for being part of this panel today. But before we do that, I just want to remind everybody of something that we actually now want to do for all of our seminars, which is just to remind everybody of the CCI Code of Conduct for things that happen in the David Attenborough building, and the way we should all be behaving with each other at meetings like this, whether you're a speaker, whether you're part of the audience. I'm not going to read through it, but our EDI working group has formulated this code. It's there on our website. There's also a QR code to make this work. My thing is not running forward here. I can go down like that, which takes us to there we go, which takes us to a QR code. Just to remind yourselves, and we just want to make sure that if anybody does pick up on any remarks or comments that they find inappropriate in any way, that they know what to do. And what you can do is actually have a word with either the seminar host or any member of the Executive Director's Office or of CCI Council, if there's anything you're concerned about. So could I actually ask just the CCI Council members just to raise their hands at this point? There we are, we've got some. Okay, so without further ado, and I'm sure this won't be necessary, but this is now something we want to be clear about into the future. So now I'm just going to introduce our panel. So we're going to hear first of all from Melissa Coath, who's from UNEP-WCMC, who's going to talk a bit about the Rio Trio from the angle of national and government engagement in the three conventions. We'll then turn to Mel Coath, who will give us a perspective on climate change and biodiversity and maybe the relationship between the two in particular. That's her area. And then we'll turn to Martin, who is going to focus in on implementation and particularly some of the perspectives of practitioners involved in conventions as well. So each of is going to speak for 5 or 6 or 7 minutes. Then we'll have a little bit of a conversation between the panelists, they who might want to react to what each other said, and then we'll open up to questions and comments from the floor. So I'll leave this up and start with you, Melissa. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm actually going to come stand here. Oh, we've agreed as a panel to do that. Good morning, everyone. As Melissa said, my name too is Melissa. Melissa de Kock, Deputy Director of UNEP-WCMC. I had the good fortune or misfortune, depending on your perspective, to attend 2 of the COPs last year. And I think everybody can agree that last year really was a huge year for multilateral environmental diplomacy. We obviously had the 3 Rio COPs. We also had the CMS COP at the beginning of the year, and we had the Summit of the Future. But this year, both planned and unplanned, is also going to be a big year. Unplanned, we've got COP 16.2, we've got the plastics negotiations 5.2 also having to continue this year. And then, of course, we've got, as Melissa pointed out, Vellum, and we've got the UN Oceans Conference, which is also very big because this is where the more optimistic people believe that the BBNJ might in fact be ratified. I believe they need 60 parties to ratify it, currently only 17, so there's quite a bit of work to do before June this year. But as Melissa said, 2030 is approaching rapidly. We've got 23 targets that need to be achieved under the CBD. 42% of global greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced by 2030. We've got the UNCCD Strategic Framework 2018 to 2030 with objectives about improving the quality of life for people who live in land-degraded areas, about mitigating drought. There's a huge amount that needs to be achieved by 2030. And then, as I was discussing with Martin, you know, around about 2027, 2028, we need to start developing or start working on the post-2030 frameworks. So for those of you that were at some of the COPs last year, I think there's a mix of both enthusiasm and a little bit of disappointment. Parties are heavily engaged. I think everybody understands that these multilateral environmental processes are in fact party-led, in that it's the parties that negotiate what goes into the text. It's the parties that negotiate how these will be done. But obviously, as my colleagues will describe, the other stakeholders have a big role to play in actually implementing these. But in terms of parties' engagement, it varies across the conventions. The CBD and the UNFCCC both have 196 parties to the conventions. The UNCCD, while the lesser known of them, actually has 197 parties, and that includes the US, which is not a party to the CBD. And they heavily engage in the discussions at the UNCCD. And what's very interesting is parties have different areas of interest, not only in terms of which negotiations to prioritize, which conventions to prioritize, but which negotiations to prioritize. And unfortunately, what this sometimes means is that the developing countries, or rather, shall I start again? The global south, global north inequity is very evident at these conventions and at these COPs. And often it all comes down to money. If you're a rich country, you can send a delegation of upwards of 100 people. They can cover all the contact groups. I think, as everyone understands, the contact groups often run simultaneously. So you have to split your delegation to be able to attend each of the contact groups. Small countries, specifically the Pacific Island developing states, sometimes only have one person attending. Countries in Africa, maybe 1 to 2. So they really get split across this, which makes it a very inequitable negotiation process. Anybody that was at the CBD the last morning when, you know, people had been sitting up for more than 24 hours couldn't help but have their hearts broken a little when the lady from the Pacific stood up and said, "We can't continue like this. We can't continue these negotiations. I'm the last person from my region still here." Everybody else had funded tickets from the CBD and they had to go home on their tickets. They couldn't extend them because we had no funding. And that's a reality. The other countries, the richer countries, could have continued negotiating if there had been appetite, but the developing countries were out of time and out of money. And we need to take these points into consideration, even at the party level. The other challenge, of course, is not only funds for participation, but funds for implementing the GBF, the UNCCD, and the UNEP-WCMC. And this has been one of the biggest issues across all the Rio Conventions and probably other MEAs. There aren't funds to implement. So, for example, we had the situation in the CBD where sorry, I'm couching my words here carefully. We had two decisions that didn't go through at the CBD. That'll be the focus of COP 16.2. One was on resource mobilization and one was on the monitoring framework. And that unfortunately was a little bit split north and south. I'm generalizing terribly here. Obviously there were nuances, but these are going to need to be negotiated as a package at 16.2. Developing countries feel you can't implement the GBF if we don't have money to do so. And if you can't implement the GBF, you can't monitor the GBF. So how can we have a decision on monitoring? So finances is going to be a really big issue. Then on to the point about synergies. It's quite clear that there's a lot of synergy between these three conventions and other conventions. You can't address the nature crisis without addressing the climate crisis. We know that nature is a key ally in the fight against climate change. We know that biodiversity loss is an outcome of land degradation. Land degradation is exacerbated by climate change. Nobody fundamentally disagrees with that. Many countries are in fact addressing these three conventions at a local level, at a national level, synergistically. Where the challenge comes in is where people want to mix mandates in the COPs. So often you will find a party when you're talking about climate change at the CBD who objects to that discussion. And it's not because they object to the concept of synergies or that they disagree with the concept of climate change. They just feel if this is an issue that hasn't been addressed coherently under the UNEP-WCMC, how can we take it from its mandate at home and try and address it under the CBD? And that has come up, for example, in the case of agriculture, which agriculture and mitigation is a huge issue in the UNEP-WCMC, which stalled, and then people try to bring it into the CBD negotiations, and some countries objected to that heavily. Just in terms of party politics around multilateralism and these three COPs. As Melissa alluded to, there are huge changes globally at the moment. The issue of populism, the issue of nationalism and isolationism is going to play out strongly, I think, this year. And multilateralism is potentially at risk. And the challenge with that is we cannot address everything in isolation. Of course, we need to downscale these conventions to the local level, but we need to take collective action across all governments to address many of these issues. And that's why the issue of synergies in the Rio Conventions is so important. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So from that kind of perspective of the government negotiations, let's now hear from, if you want to, are you happy to stand as well? Now to hear your perspectives, I think particularly on the synergy question and climate and biodiversity.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Melanie Coath. I'm RSPB's climate lead, and just flicking through to the start of presentation. Great. So yes, I'm going to be talking about the intersection between climate change and biodiversity in the conventions. So I'll touch again on the point that Melissa just made around the kind of mismatch between where the science is and the policy is. And then I'll look at each of the conventions in turn and how biodiversity and climate change action are being taken together. I'm a bit croaky today, so if you stop being able to hear me in the back row, please do wave at me and I'll try and project a little bit more. So as we were just hearing, the science is really clear on tackling the crises together. And this report that you can see in the picture there was really kind of fundamental to setting out the latest science. So this was the first ever joint report between the climate science body, the IPCC, and the biodiversity body, IPBES. And yeah, it really underlined the points we know. Climate change exacerbates biodiversity loss. Biodiversity helps mitigate both climate change and help adaptation. And there's also that intrinsic link with land degradation and desertification. But we obviously have three very separate conventions. Back in the 1990s, that science connection was not so well understood, and it was decided for quite obvious institutional and logistical reasons that there wouldn't be an environmental convention on everything, but it would be broken down into these separate areas. But now, to reflect that latest science, there's obviously a lot of work to do to kind of build up those synergies and in a way that makes sense and has institutional buy-in and doesn't come up against those mandate problems that we were just hearing about. So the UNCCD, I'm afraid this is the one that I know the least about. It's not one that I work on directly, but the UNCCD had its 16th COP just before Christmas last year, and actually Synergies had quite a lot of discussion time, was quite high profile, and that focus on kind of synergies and trade-offs was really quite a big discussion point between the three conventions. Now, the focus there was particularly on that implementation level, on strengthening the synergies between the national plans that need to be produced by each convention to implement those policies at that national level. So parties were invited to bring together not just the desertification, land degradation and drought, but also climate change and biodiversity together in a holistic way. And that was the first time they've been invited to do so. And there was also work requested by the for the Secretariat by parties to promote data sharing across the conventions and also to connect up, do more connection across the work of IPBES, IPCC and the Science Policy Interface, which brings together the work of those two science bodies with the policy space. So some good progress there. Even better has been the progress made in the CBD on climate biodiversity synergies. So many of you will be familiar with the Global Biodiversity Framework and Target 8 that sits within that, which is looking at minimising the impacts of climate change on biodiversity and building resilience. So there's already a strand of negotiations that took place at COP16 on climate and biodiversity. And there were some really exciting decisions on synergies that came out of that. So there was a very clear acknowledgement of the need to tackle the crises in tandem, reflected into the policy decisions. There was a mandate to explore formal collaboration between the Rio Conventions for the first time. So that's integrating that delivery of the Paris Agreement goals and the Global Biodiversity Framework in a much more formal way. There was a proposal for a joint expert meeting to take place in 2025. Now the date for that hasn't been set, and we understand a bit of momentum has kind of fallen away from that. So that's something that we still really need to see happen, and we will be pushing for. And also an invitation for parties to submit topics for potential joint work. So this is something that is going forward. The submissions will be collated by May from all parties and observers to the process, and that will be a really good opportunity to see where parties are prepared to collaborate across the conventions. And this decision also put in place the groundwork necessary for that enhanced collaboration at the implementation level in aligning the national plans between the CBD, so the NBSAPs under the CBD and the NDCs, nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So some really good progress on the CBD side. A lot less progress on the UNFCCC side, and this is the kind of hardest nut to crack. So I haven't given a review of what happened at COP29 because that COP focused on finance, climate finance, and it was incredibly challenging to get anything on nature recognised at that COP because of the politically contentious nature of the finance discussions. But we do have some good hooks. So in the Paris Agreement itself, there's language that mandates parties to conserve and enhance their sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases, so sinks and reservoirs is ecosystems. So there's some good language there. And much more recently, just over a year ago, the Global Stocktake, which was doing a review of how parties are getting on against the Paris Agreement goals, really underlined, and you can see I've picked out some of that text in bold, conserving, protecting and restoring nature and ecosystems, halting and reversing deforestation and forest degradation, and critically, that language around those actions being in line with the GBF. So that is a significant step forward, but there's still a heck of a lot more to do to elevate synergies within the UNFCCC to bring it up to that level that the CBD has made progress on. Unfortunately, there are some real problems within the way the UNFCCC operates, which mean that it's actually quite hard to progress measures to ensure that ecosystems retain their integrity. Now, retaining ecosystem integrity is absolutely critical to avoiding ecosystem collapse and breakdown and the release of huge quantities of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But there aren't any frameworks within the UNFCCC for how parties measuring or monitoring the condition of their forests, their peatlands, their wetlands, their carbon-dense ecosystems. So without that framework, that's a real challenge. There's no indicators for the risks that are posed to ecosystems. That lack of understanding of that concept of ecosystem integrity is holding back parties from making progress, both conceptually at the convention level and in their implementation. And the actual definitions of ecosystems like forests and the ways that their emissions are accounted are actually, the way that system works actually encourages ecosystem degradation rather than protection. So there's a lot more that I could say behind that last point, but this is just 5 minutes, but we can come back to it. It's a fundamental problem within the system that needs fixing. So there are two big things happening this year. There's the opportunity for NGOs to submit our own submission to the CBD process on these opportunities for collaboration across the conventions. So we have been doing that. My colleague Fiona, sitting in the front row there, who leads RSPB CBD work, has been coordinating a very large group of NGOs working on synergies across the conventions. Don't worry about reading this little screenshot at the bottom there. That just gives you a sense of what our submission looks like. But in terms of the key headlines that we are sharing with governments, and also we're going to put forward in our submission, we're really supporting a joint work programme across the conventions. We see there is really that need for an institutional framework to bring together the action on the conventions that gets around this kind of mandate problem and actually gives an opportunity, for example, to provide guidelines for how countries can align their national plans and many other things. It's really critical that action on climate change doesn't undermine the goals of the other conventions. I think many of us can think of opportunities where climate action leads to biodiversity loss, and that has to be avoided. And always making sure that actions under the Rio Conventions don't impact negatively on human rights is, of course, critical. Coming back to this, enhancing the understanding of ecological integrity, what we're proposing is that a new expert group is set up in the UNFCCC that brings together that knowledge and expertise of biodiversity and its fundamental functional role that it plays in climate change mitigation and adaptation. We see that as the critical way to address the problems at the moment in the UNFCCC structure. And aligning, monitoring and reporting under the Rio Conventions is going to make everything a lot more integrated. And then we heard about the opportunities with COP30 this year. So this graphic gives the main discussion topics that the Brazilian presidency has put forward for COP30. And you can see that biodiversity preservation is one of them, which is fantastic. It's the first time it's been as explicit in a UNFCCC COP. So real opportunities to make policy progress on nature and deforestation. We know the Brazilian presidency is, however, very keen on the concept of bioeconomy, which could be a bit of a poison chalice. So that could be quite an extractive approach to natural resources rather than the restorative approach. And I myself and colleagues have concerns that that could run at odds with the synergies agenda. So that's definitely one to watch. But there could be some quite exciting outcomes. The presidency is developing a new financing facility for standing forests called the Tropical Forest Finance Facility. All of these things have question marks under them because let's see how the politics plays out and what it's possible to land, but that will hopefully be one of them. We also hope to see new decision text on synergies that reflect some of the progress made in the CBD. We're pushing hard for this joint work programme, and actually that's an idea that Brazil brought to the CBD negotiations. So as the presidency, the fact that they've already brought that forward more formally as a proposal is exciting, and we hope that they might drive that forward. And we're going to push to land this new expert group on biodiversity within the UNFCCC. So a real opportunity for nature NGOs. So just to wrap, it's an exciting time to drive forward the progress on international collaboration and science-driven policy. We have the science and now the processes for that collaboration are starting to be developed. We know we need to go a lot further to ensure that we get stronger policy coherence. We're going to need money to do it. And we've seen from all of the convention discussions around money that that's really challenging, but we can't escape that. But hopefully this will lead to strengthened governance for nature-based climate change action. I've probably gone over time already. If anyone's interested later in how we work at COPs in achieving some of these outcomes, we can talk about that too. But I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I hope might we be able to share the slides of
Yes,
the seminar, because that was very useful on some of the facts and the commitments. Brilliant. So Martin.
So I'm Martin Harper. I'm the Chief Executive of BirdLife International. Those of you who don't know BirdLife, we are 123 partners in 119 countries, and we're very lucky to have the RSPB as our UK partner. And so we get to benefit from the amazing expertise of people like Melanie. So I'm going to talk to you about what it takes to actually translate all of those big global ambitions into real action on the ground. I'm very mindful, as indeed both the two Melissas mentioned sort of the geopolitical context at the moment. We happen to have a meeting of our advisory group the day after the US election, and they're global people from around the world. And one of the people asked, what are we going to do now? There was obviously real worry about what the shift in US political situation would mean for our world. But one of our advisors said something which I think is incredibly important for all of us who's working in this field in this period, which is you continue to focus on those collaborations, those strategic partnerships that deliver you real change. So however you feel about how destabilized and disruptive things are at the moment, there are still really important strategic collaborations which do affect real change. I'm going to talk about three. They're different, but hopefully they give you a flavour of the sort of things that we can still absolutely deliver in order to sort of translate that ambition down to ground, into the ground. So I'm going to talk to you about the work of BirdLife International Partnership, but of course I'm really talking about how civil society organisations work around the world. And the three examples I'm going to talk about what's been happening at an EU level around translating some of the global commitments to regional action. I'm going to talk to you about the work we do with the multilateral development banks, about mobilising more finance, particularly for migratory bird conservation. And I'm going to talk to you about what's been going on in the Great Green Wall in Africa. Three examples, hopefully a bit of a tour around the world. But I'm going to start in the European Union because BirdLife, we happen to have partners in all 27 member states. We also have an office in Brussels facing into the institutions. And of course, we still believe that Europe, in its broadest sense, can be a leader when it comes to environmental standards. And we have a very strong track record of influencing change at a European level, both within Brussels, but also within member states. And when Ursula von der Leyen became the Commission President in 2020, she arrived with essentially a mandate for the new Green Deal. And that was really the most audacious plan to transform Europe's legislation and policies to basically deliver a decarbonisation agenda, but we ended up convincing her and her cabinet to actually focus on a nature positive agenda as well. And so that Green Deal resulted in things like new Climate Act, delivering 55 reductions by 2030, and hopefully that's going to be reformed to get to 90% by 2040. That's a new proposal. But it also included the desire to create a new biodiversity strategy for the European Union. And that pretty much preempted and then solidified all the commitments that came out of the Global Biodiversity Framework, things like 30 by 30 and Target 3, action for species recovery, et cetera, et cetera. But we also convinced the European Commission and ultimately the European Union to establish legally binding targets for nature restoration. So those of you who know the GBF well know Target 2 is all about 30% of degraded land to be restored by 2030. And we sold that idea into the Commission, and then we won the debate over a 2-year campaign to establish the world's first law to basically drive nature restoration. 30% of all land, freshwater and sea to have nature restoration action in each of the member states by 2030. A huge amount of work went into that. And again, as Melissa mentioned, there was also an incredible backlash, particularly from the farming community who were trying to sort of kill that law, but we won it. And we won it because civil society came together and we actually won the argument, we got the law passed, and now we implement it in each of the 27 countries. And what BirdLife is now doing is supporting our partners to make sure each of the 27 member states has the necessary technical advice and guidance to actually then implement those laws in each of the 27 countries. So that's my first example about how you translate big ambition into action. The second one's very different, all about the multilateral development banks. So these are supranational finance institutions created by sovereign states designed to support developing countries primarily to deliver the goals that they have, including, of course, the UN goals relating to the 3 agreements we're talking about. And back in 2021, 11 of the 20 multilateral development banks, they signed up to a commitment to do more for nature, people and the planet. And that said that they wanted to do more to try and address the drivers of biodiversity loss and at the same time to drive nature positive investments. And that was a really important hook for us to then say, support us in our wild ambition to create ecologically coherent network of sites for migratory birds in each of the big flyways of the world. And so we have forged partnerships with the Asian Development Bank and the Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean to mobilize up to 8 billion over the next 10, 15 years or so to try and protect more sites in each of the flyways in the Americas and the East Asian Australasian flyway. And so, for example, in East Asia, Australasia, we have helped them identify 50 sites across 10 countries which are eligible for funding from these development banks to then try and mobilize resources to protect yes, these sites which are important for birds, but also to support all of the other benefits that those sites provide for people and indeed in terms of climate. And just late last year, we had the first example of a site which had received some of the financing, mobilizing 308 million for multiple sources, including from the Asian Development Bank, at a place called South Dongting Lake in China. It's a huge lake, over 170,000 hectares or so, about 1 million people living around it. And that money is all designed to support sustainable economic development and livelihoods for the people living around the lake, but also to restore 12,000 hectares of that lake, a site which is incredibly important for migratory birds, especially species like lesser white-fronted goose. So that's an example of mobilizing the resources that are now on the table for one site in a region, and we're hoping to replicate that in the Americas with CAF, Development Bank for Latin America, but also do the same in Africa, hopefully with the World Bank, and then also Central Asia flyway as well. So multilateral development banks changing the way in which they finance things to deliver wins for people, birds, and the climate. And my third example is the Great Green Wall, which actually I think deserves a whole seminar all in its own right. So obviously very much linked to the UNCCD, with 46% of Africa's land being really degraded. And this is focusing on the plan to try and essentially green parts of the Sahel from coast to coast. And the ambition, which I think was struck more than 18 years or so ago, was to try and basically deliver something like 200 million hectares, essentially, of new vegetation from coast to coast across the Sahelian region. And that's a fantastic ambition. But of course, as we all know in nature conservation, and put the wrong trees in the wrong place can cause all sorts of problems. And even in the Sahel, there's a whole mosaic of habitats which are really for birds and other wildlife. And so what we've been trying to do is work with the Pan-African Green Wall Agency at a country level to try and make sure that biodiversity is mainstreamed into the ambitions of the Great Green Wall. And so we've struck agreements to try and help with habitat management, but also crucially to set up biodiversity monitoring groups within 4 of the countries in the Sahelian region to make sure that that tree planting is done in the right place, and we can then work out what's happening to biodiversity. So I just give you these 3 examples because I think when you hear about these global conventions and about, and the intricacies, which are important in terms of setting the scene for nature conservation around the world, we have to make sure that we find the way to deliver action on the ground. And so I just wanted to make sure that you are all absolutely confident that not just BirdLife, but elsewhere, there are amazingly ambitious transformational interventions which are taking place, which are basically all down to incredible strategic partnerships, which we will need more of over the coming years.
Fantastic array, and I wanted to ask each of you to reflect on what others have said, but I've actually got a couple of questions that you might want to think about. So first of all, we've heard about the importance of synergies. And yet from Melissa, we heard about the way the government negotiations pan out. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how these questions of the crossovers and the joint agendas might move forward at a time when we still have NCDs for climate, NBSATs for biodiversity. So what at the country level, the parties are able to do about addressing these agendas jointly? I had a question that it'd be interesting to hear from each of you about the roles of science and evidence. I mean, at CCI, we're all about connecting evidence and action. And we've heard a little bit about new working groups or the importance of data, but it would be great to hear a little bit more about that, and potentially areas where CCI partners, and with this unique opportunity we have to bring science and action together, how perhaps partners should be contributing. And then my third question was about people in CCI. We're now fundamentally talking about transformative restoration for people in a changing climate. You've both, I mean, in a way, people, their livelihoods, their ways of being with nature and climate are at the heart of everything we've talked about. And yet, I think many of the examples given also open the way potentially to forms of conservation or protection or solutionism that could be quite damaging in terms of excluding people from rights to be with nature, to be in landscapes and so on. And so I'd just like to hear a little bit about who's advocating for, whether it's Indigenous groups, local groups, and how those fundamentally perhaps more social justice agendas are feeding into what we want. So perhaps just a couple of minutes back to each of you, and then anything you'd like to say in response to the others before we open up the floor. Melissa, yeah.
If I might start with your last question.
Yeah.
So two of the best outcomes last year were the fact that the UNCCD created an Indigenous Peoples Caucus.
Yeah.
And also even bigger was the creation of an Indigenous Peoples subsidiary body at the CBD.
Yeah.
Which shows not only the recognition of Indigenous peoples, but the ability for them to now engage in decision making. So I think that the IFB in the CBD and the Indigenous people at the UNCCD have done a remarkable job of getting their voices heard. So I don't know the UNEP-WCMC as well, so I'm hoping you'll be able to answer that. But I'm not that worried in the CBD and UNCCD anymore because they now have a place at the table. So I'm very pleased about that. I'll come back to your point about addressing jointly after I think everybody else has responded.
A few thoughts. So the last one first, there's definitely a lot of scope for improvement on the Indigenous peoples within the UNEP-WCMC, so there is some language. But for example, take the finance package that was agreed at the last COP, everything that would have led to good quality on that, so that included all the nature language we wanted to see, but also the human rights language we wanted to see out. So there's still a lot of scope for improvement there, and as NGOs we always push very hard to have Indigenous people and local community rights. So, you know, we know that the environmental stewardship role that they play is absolutely fundamental in biodiversity conservation. So that sort of speaks to that kind of rights-based approach that I was talking about earlier. A few other thoughts, absolutely the role of science and evidence, and this ad hoc technical expert group that we want to see under the UNEP-WCMC is our effort to kind of really bring that science in, because it's very clear that the UNEP-WCMC negotiators just don't have that knowledge on the fundamental importance of nature. And without that in the process, the political decisions that are being taken are never going to be the ones that represent a kind of synergistic approach. A few thoughts on just some points that other panelists were making. In terms of the role of other stakeholders, if we don't get good negotiated outcomes, we may still achieve good outcomes from the negotiations, which sounds strange, from the negotiations process. So there's both the formal governmental decision-making process, but there's also something called the action agenda, which is led by the presidency. So for example, at COP26, which was hosted in the UK, there was an action agenda item around nature and forests that led to the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on halting and reversing deforestation, which 145 countries signed up to. And 3 years later, that actually got into the negotiated text. So that was a kind of interim element of progress. So governments can really drive that. The global south, global north inequity is a really huge point. So one of the approaches, if we don't get or can't get a standalone decision item on nature and climate out of COP30, is to really look at embedding nature across every strand. But if you only have 2 people from a country who have capacity to negotiate, they just don't have the expertise or mental headspace to think, oh, and where can I put nature in all of this stuff? It's not on their agenda. They're just going to be looking, if they're from the global south, that there's some good ambition and there's some good finance to support it. And that's it. Yeah. And the final point was just speaking to kind of Martin's point on implementation and the role of, multilateral development banks. I was in a conversation last week where somebody said, well, do we really need to have all these detailed conversations about this very high level policy decision making, integrating the conventions? What we just need is good implementation on the ground. But actually what really sends the signals for governments to implement and for the finance to be mobilized is these very high level signals. And without the Paris Agreement, you wouldn't get global corporations lining up behind a 1.5 degree target. Without the global biodiversity framework, you wouldn't get investment in halting biodiversity loss. So we have to work at all these levels. And my role working at convention level, Fiona, my colleague on CBD, might feel the same. It feels so far away from tangible delivery, but actually it's a really critical driver.
Yeah, that last point is absolutely fundamental, completely agree. And we haven't even talked about really the role of the sector, because they are really we're trying to help them align to not just target 15 of the CBD, but also the other commitments. So we've been working with others in the Nature Positive Initiative to try and come up with state of nature metrics, which hopefully companies then can measure to determine their impact. Just a couple of things, one on social safeguards and one on the science point. So as the M's have said, obviously the voice of Indigenous peoples is more formally recognised now, particularly in CFD, but also in UCCD, which is great. And actually one of the things that we do within the BirdLife network is try and make sure that BirdLife partners are actually part of government delegations, and that can help bolster it away and making sure that they're representing the views there. But the other thing is that I think pretty much every international conservation organisation has to improve the way they take on board sort of social safeguards and the way they work. And so within BirdLife at the moment, we're reviewing our social safeguards policy and indeed how we then embed that into projects and programs. So for example, a program we have in the Andes called Conserva Aves with multiple partners, that is all designed to support Indigenous people and local communities to have more resources to deliver what they want in terms of improved protection for subnational protected areas. That is a re-granting program to support Indigenous people and local communities, and we're trying to make sure that we do that in absolutely the right way. And it's incredibly successful, and hopefully we are. We need to replicate that around the world. Last point about science. Of course, science matters, and it underpins everything that we do, but it isn't enough. And it really isn't enough. All of the debates which happen in the US, Europe, parts of Japan, even elsewhere around the world, in global north, science can easily get marginalized. We have to be absolutely better at winning the public argument for investing in nature. Science is important. It is not the only thing. We have to be much smarter about which channels of communication to be used, the way we frame the conversations, the way we create allies, so that we are not boxed in to essentially a left-leaning movement, but when they're out of power, are irrelevant. And this is our huge challenge as a movement in this time now.
Great points. Well, look, let's open up. We've got about 15 minutes for questions or comments. I mean, I know around the room, many of you have been at these global events, as well as having experiences of what they can and can't achieve, or what they should be looking to achieve. So let's take perhaps a group of questions, then I'll come back to the panel. Chris.
Yeah, thank you. It's fantastic for all of you. I've got loads of questions. I'm going to limit myself to 2. One is just what role do you think universities and university researchers can play, given the role of the University of Cambridge in the CCI partnership? And the other was more, if we're a bit pessimistic about the current isolationist turn that you mentioned and everything that's happening in the world, is there any possible silver lining if the MEA processes as we currently understand them kind of come off the rails completely? We're working towards consensus at the moment, which is incredibly difficult to achieve. Is there an alternative paradigm out there if things just really fall apart, bad as that might seem?
Brilliant. I'm going to ask you to hold those and make a note. Let's perhaps take a group of thoughts. Somebody online, Jack?
Yeah, there's a question. So it says, question to all the speakers following on from your discussion on synergies across the Rio Trio. IPBES has just issued the Nexus Assessment, which provides a holistic plan of action to address the interlinked crises of biodiversity, climate, water, food, and health together. How do you think we best use this opportunity and weave the response actions into the Rio Trio?
That's a Nexus report, which I think will actually be talked about at the Nature Action Dialogues that UNEP-WCMC are talking about, and David Abura will be giving a keynote there. So that will be interesting to hear more about that. Yes.
Yeah, there's talk at the end about kind of politically not being boxed into one kind of camp or the other. You mentioned a little bit about von der Leyen and her, being kind of centre-right figure and her still being quite nature positive in that sense. How robust are those gains as we see the kind of nationalist right kind of making gains in Europe? There's kind of talk of von der Leyen's mandate now coming more from that hard right side of the parliament. How sustainable is that politically? How sustainable is sustainability, I suppose, is the question.
On Europe. Anybody else in this round? Yes.
I don't know if this is a completely impossible question, but given that there's the focus of the treaties on, say, funding and the key high ambition focuses, how can we as organizations then really bring the idea of synergy to the fore without it getting lost? I'm thinking a lot with, say, the plastics treaty, trying to bring that into these other treaty spaces, and whether it's sort of we see so often similarly with the plastics treaty is that countries are so focused on funding and the sort of the three priority topics, but then trying to get anyone to think about nature is just so low on the priority. So yeah, how to bring that in and not get it lost.
Yeah. So perhaps I'll come back to the three of you. I mean, maybe you can pick up on questions as you wish. Melissa, maybe come to you.
Sure. I'll take the last question again first. So interestingly enough, there's a process called the Bern process, which was started in, I think, 2018 by the government of Switzerland with various other parties. And what it does, it brings together 13 or so multilateral environmental agreements to talk about cooperation and collaboration, primarily with a focus on implementing what was then the post-2020 framework and now the GBF. But there is that space to have all the MEAs come together and have these discussions. So once the plastic treaty is hopefully done, they might well be part of the Bern process. And that is something that's being driven very heavily by UNEP and various parties to try and get everybody on the same page and not have things drop off. So that when you're doing a plastics treaty, you're thinking about biodiversity. When you're thinking about biodiversity, you're thinking about the impacts of plastics and all of that. But it is a big ask. And I'm actually going to take the opportunity to address Melissa's question, which is somewhat linked, which is how do you do these joint programs of work? And one of the opportunities and challenges at the moment is that when you have focal points for each of these treaties, they're often housed in different ministries. So the CBD is Ministry of Environment, UNFCCC, Ministry of Climate, and unless those ministries are already integrated, you can have 13 focal points in 13 different ministries. What is a really interesting approach is Argentina, who has all the focal points sitting in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they're almost forced into a situation where they need to collaborate. So that's one of the areas of opportunity is countries need to bring their focal points together so that when an NDC is being developed or when an NBSAP is being developed, when a development plan is being developed, all these issues are being discussed and thought about. Then I want to pick up on the alternative paradigm. Having said initially that the multilateral processes are party-led, the influence and the engagement of CSOs, of Indigenous peoples, of the business sector has been a phenomenal success this past year. And I think if One, if the multilateralism fails, which obviously I hope it and believe it won't, I think it'll pull through. I think there is so much amazing groundswell from so many actors on the ground to do the good work that I think it'll continue. The other element is that a lot of countries are doing great work regardless of the international conventions. They're doing it to adhere to them, but they're also doing it because they want to. You obviously get countries that are now opening up fields to oil and gas and doing appalling things, but I like to believe that those are in the minority. I do believe that we're seeing a positive trajectory rather than a negative one. That's my upbeat end.
Oh, yeah, I agree with everything you just said on that last point. And I think when we saw under the last Trump regime, the individual state governments really stepping up in their action is a good example of that, and one that we can and should cling on to over the next 4 years. In terms of the role that university researchers can play, I think when research that's relevant to these policy spaces is being conducted, when that research is published, to see that as the start rather than the finish of the process. Been working really closely with the Nature-Based Solutions Institute in Oxford, who come along to the NGO meetings and actually meet with government alongside NGOs to bring that research expertise as part of the conversations that we have with government. That's hugely helpful because NGOs are seen as having a bit of a loaded agenda, whereas the researchers are not. So they're seen as being more impartial and therefore more influential in those spaces. And so where there is kind of, research that's aligned with trying to influence policy outcomes or bring the right evidence to influence policy outcomes, actually connecting with those who are doing the advocacy and, even attending these spaces and doing presentations stuff is super important. And I think that connects with the next assessment question, which is a huge foundational piece of work around these connections. It's sort of the next big thing since the IPCC at Birth workshop report that I flagged in my presentation, and hugely powerful, and governments need to hear it, and the focal points that are doing that national plan implementation need to hear it. And so again, the advocacy of that, rather than just thinking that people are going to voluntarily go and extract that information, that kind of rollout of advocacy around that from the science community will be really critical. And then sort of bringing synergies to the fore when everyone's focused on these kind of top level priorities. From my experience in the UNEP-WCMC, as I alluded to in the presentation, that's a really significant challenge. I think it's really helpful that the CBD is doing some heavy lifting in that space in coming up with these new processes. So inviting parties to come up with what they see as the opportunities for joint work, and inviting parties to put forward policy proposals that are going to align these national plans. So because the CBD has kind of initiated that process, now other parts of government are going to have to join that conversation. And so I think that's really helpful, because when you're looking at just the leads on climate or the leads on plastic, they often don't have capacity to think about that.
Martin.
Well, I think Melissa and Melanie have covered most questions. I'll just quickly do the EU. So clearly after the last election, there's been a shift. And, we're already seeing some of the implications of that shift. For example, big investigations being called into NGO funding, and we're having to fight for the right for the principle of the Lisbon Treaty still to essentially provide support for civil society to have a voice in some of those discussions. I think about an hour ago, the new agricultural direction, the new farming policy was being sort of launched. I haven't seen the detail on it, and that would be a good test to see what direction of travel the new commission wants to go in. As I said earlier, I think we are likely to get plans on the table for a 90% reduction by 2040 to then amend the climate law, which should be, right. But I don't want to be naive. This is going to be a hell of a battle over the next few years to keep the EU in its leadership role. We'll focus on the implementation of laws that have already been in place, habitats and birds directives, and obviously the nature restoration law. And if, for example, those regulations are in the line of fire, as they were under von der Leyen's predecessor, Juncker, we will, of course, man the barricades, defend, but also continue to make the case as to why a healthy natural environment is actually fundamental to underpinning prosperity of all people, not just European citizens, but elsewhere around the world. So, you know, but that's again worth another whole seminar on its own.
Absolutely. So, thank you all so much. I think this has been incredibly enlightening. And I mean, a few take-home messages. Firstly, that I think there are ongoing seminars to be had. I think it's absolutely, I mean, what you've, I think, really shown us is that swathe between there's the multilateral negotiations and funding, there's then what national governments are doing, it's what civil society is doing, and part of it is adding those things up. But what's also, I think, come through very strongly is the importance of the narratives, actually, of the communication about this. And that's something that doesn't necessarily happen through the formal things and events and discussions that happen in these meetings, but they provide a very good hook sometimes for telling these stories, fostering these stories perhaps of hope, and it's been good to hear some optimism, but actually some narratives that add up across these convention moments and galvanize the kind of action one wants to see from governments, but also very much from businesses and civil societies. I think that's been very helpful. Just to flag that at CCI, well, I think we have a unique opportunity. We're deeply involved in different ways with these conventions, as well as with the research and the science that might relate to them. We're just in a small task team set up, which we're calling the boat to Belém and beyond to 2030, with the boat kind of alluding to river maps rather than road maps, and also seeing that Belém moment, which I think is significant for the reasons colleagues have mentioned, as part of a chain of discussions and communications opportunities leading up to 2030. So I think we'll be setting out some further events, communications, ways in which we might be engaging across CCI and with partners to make sure really that nature and people are at the heart of the decision making and the action that unfolds over the next period. And in that vein, the next CCI seminar is not irrelevant, because on the 5th of March, we've got one which is co-hosted with BirdLife, focusing on the Altindala initiative in Kazakhstan, which is an example of a multi-partner initiative, looking at restoration at a very large scale in a very transformative way. And I think will be a chance to hear about some of the kind of action on the ground, which should be being made accessible and facilitated by the kinds of global meetings that we focused on today. So big thank you to our panelists and thank you to all of you.